Hi guys, Molton here and welcome back to another opening video. This time we're looking at the Lowenthal Sicilian, which is a really tricky and fun opening in the Sicilian defense. For those of you who want to avoid some of the more popular options in the main line, then this could be the perfect Sicilian for you since it's relatively quick and easy to learn and also offers a lot of tactical opportunity. Also, stick around to the end of the video as usual and I'll walk you through all the various ideas, setups and the main variations you should know. So at the end of it, you'll have a complete working repertoire. And like, comment, subscribe if you find the video useful. Otherwise, roll intro and let's get started. Okay, so the Lowenthal Sicilian starts out after e4, c5, knight f3, knight to c6, pawn to d4, we capture, and then we play this move pawn to e5. Now I'll walk you through some of the lesser played moves first, but these are probably the ones you'll find most common at a lower level. For example, here you could meet the move knight to b3. Against these type of moves, usually what black will look to do is attack the center with the move knight to f6. And then let's say if white defends the center, we'll either pin the knight with the move bishop to b4 first, attacking the pawn, and at any given opportunity we're looking to get this pawn break with the move pawn to d5, which will completely free up our position. So this is one option that white can play, knight to b3, but it offers black pretty easy response to it. So for example, another move might be knight to f5. After knight to f5, we immediately want to counter in the center with the move pawn to d5. And this is probably the easiest solution. Tactically, it leads to a lot of simplification and a very comfortable position for black. So people don't normally opt for that. Another move is knight to f3. The easiest remedy to this is just to play knight to f6. And here Ndb5, a very tricky grandmaster, with the white pieces tried to move bishop to c4. But I think the easiest remedy to this is you could just play bishop to c5 if you want to keep some pieces on, and then follow through with the move pawn to d6, where you do have this weakness on d5, but you have enough sort of typical counterplay in the Sicilian where you can sort of play around it, and it should be fine for black. Or you could just take the pawn and meet the idea of queen d5 with a queen trade with queen a5 check. And here, after trading off a few pieces, let's say as such, and playing the move pawn to d5, you lose the bishop pair. You get the bishop pair, but you give yourself this isolated pawn on d5. But it should be absolutely fine for black, and you should be fully equalized. So after the move pawn to e5, the main moves here for white, which you will most likely meet, will be knight takes c6 or knight to b5. So we'll start with knight takes c6. Here I think black is relatively comfortable after the move b takes c6. For example, bishop c4 is met by knight to f6, and we can just develop our bishop again to b4, attack the pawn, look to castle, and maybe play the move pawn to d5. Sometimes you can even delay castling. If your opponent brings the bishop out to g5 really early, you can look at sort of just keeping your king in the center for a while and maybe kick the bishop away with something like h6, and even g5 in some instances can sort of render this bishop quite bad on g3. But the main move by far, and the one we'll be focusing on, is the move knight to b5. So after the move knight to b5, the whole point of this Sicilian is to give away the d6 square and the bishop actually. So we play the move pawn to a6, we give this square away, white will capture with the queen, and then we chase the queen away with the move queen to f6. So after this move queen to f6, white has a few different options. We'll look at queen takes f6 first, because this will be the main option, one of the main options, if he wants to avoid sort of the trickier lines and go into the endgame. After this, we go knight takes f6. Here, for example, again, bishop d3, we always meet it with a break in the center. So most people will play the move knight to c3, and here we want to play this move knight to b4 to attack the pawn on c2, which essentially forces white to play bishop to d3, since if he tries to defend it with the king, we can move the other knight to g4 and we have this sort of funny position where we're attacking both pawns. Here, a move like bishop e3 will just take it and go into this middle game. So after the move bishop to d3, we should follow through with the move pawn to d6 here. I think this is better than moves like pawn to d5. For example, here after the move bishop to g5, we can follow through with bishop to e6. And now there are a few options for white to simplify, but I don't think you should be particularly worried about them. So for example, one is bishop takes f6, pawn takes f4. So this has been played in a number of different games. And after the move knight takes d3 takes, we can go into this endgame position with the move pawn to f5. Now, it's very important that you play the move pawn to f5 here because you want to get rid of your double pawns as soon as you possibly can. And also you want to avoid white playing the move pawn to f5 and then sticking the knight into the d5 square. So it's very important to get rid of this double pawns. Now, I'll give you a few variations here. So for example, let's say white plays rook f1. The main idea here for black is that we're going to allow white to play f5 and we're just going to reroute our bishop to the c6 square. Now, it doesn't look like much here at all and it's really just an equal position. But once you play, let's say h5 and get some position like this, in this particular game, black managed to hold quite comfortably and there was really no play left for white after the move pawn to b5. So same goes if they castle back here. After the move pawn takes f5, bishop goes to d7, pawn takes on e4, a bishop to c6, and we can play exactly the same plan. So we put our pawn on h5, king to e7, and we just defend the d6 pawn, and it should just be an equal position here without much trouble. So let's go back to queen takes f6, knight c3, d6, bishop g5. Now, after the move bishop to g5 and bishop to e6, if white doesn't capture and goes for castles queenside instead, then the remedy to this was well demonstrated by Judith Polgar with the black pieces here, who played knight to g4, hitting the pawn on f2, and after the bishop went back to h4, black played this move pawn to g5, sort of distracting the bishop, forcing it to go back to g3 since you cannot capture because you lose the rook. So bishop to g3, and now the king goes to e7, and notice how black has managed to put all the pawns on the dark squares. So you always want to put your pawns on the opposite color of the bishop that you currently have, and at the same time black is neutralizing the bishop pair of whites by essentially using the pawn structure to block out this dark squared bishop. So this is absolutely fine for black. So after the move queen f6, I actually think the most challenging move here is, or one of the most challenging moves is queen d2, which is not actually played that often, but I think this is one of the best moves for white. After this option, I was spending a lot of time on knight g to e7, but I decided to go with queen g6 as the recommendation instead. And here I want you to focus on a plan involving playing d6 and f5, getting immediate counterplay. This is probably your best option. So for example, if f3 here, I suggest we go knight g to e7, and let's say after bishop to d3 castles, d6. White's main idea is to get a Maroczy bind with the move pawn to c4 and clamp down on our position and slowly sort of get the advantage with the bishop pair. But we're not going to allow that because we're going to get immediate counterplay with the move pawn to f5 here. And our idea is we're going to try and challenge this bind in the center. Perhaps next move we will take the pawn and bring our bishop out to f5. We have some ideas sometimes of closing everything up with f4 as well, but most likely we will take on e4 and play bishop f5, look for moves like d5 and so on, where I think black has sufficient counterplay. If instead after queen g6 white plays the move knight to c3, I think this can be a very challenging move. Here there are a couple of tempting moves, like for example pawn to d5 is something I spent some time analyzing, but I just couldn't make it work in any way. After pawn takes knight d4, queen takes g2, something like this, this is okay. But the problem is after knight takes d5 and move 10, you go into this line with queen takes e4, bishop to e2, queen takes g2, knight check. Now, you essentially have to play king f8 here, because after the move king f7, what will happen is white will move the rook and eventually play this move pawn to b3, and there's no good way of stopping bishop to a3 check. So therefore in this position you have to go king f8, but I don't find this position too appealing at all, because after the move pawn to b3, bishop a3 check, the king moves across and white castles queenside. It is incredibly difficult to defend this position, and it's not one I would suggest you go into. So instead of the move pawn to d5, I'm suggesting we stick with the move pawn to d6, which is not actually played much, if at all. I couldn't find any games after the move pawn to d6. In this position, knight d5 no longer works, because after queen takes and you play queen takes g2, and then knight check doesn't work in this particular position after king d7. So he doesn't have knight d5, so he can try to move pawn to f3 instead, but I think we should stick with the same plan. So we go knight to e7, castles kingside, and follow through with our usual attack with pawn to f5. And I don't mind black's chances at all in this position. So now we get into the main line option, which is queen to d1. Now things get really hectic after this move. So we go queen g6 first. Now white should play the move knight c3, the most popular move as well. And now we throw in a tactic where everything gets incredibly messy. But I find the positions really enjoyable to play. And it's something you can definitely catch some strong players who aren't prepared out, for sure. Pawn takes on d5 is well met by knight to d4, so you don't have to worry about this particular move, because after bishop to d3, queen takes g2, bishop goes to e4, the game might continue queen h3. Here white has a few options, like for example queen d3 or bishop e3, but it's all fine for black. You can just develop the rest of your pieces, and for example let's say knight f6, and here probably white is forced to exchange some pieces like this, which will make black's life a lot easier. Moves like rook to g1, keeping pieces on, shouldn't be much of a worry either for black. So for example, just castle. And the issue for white is that with the bishop on g4, he's unable to safely castle the king to the queen side. And if he's not able to get the king to safety, then there's really no attack on the king side, which we have to worry about. So as long as we keep the king stuck in the center, it should be fine. Here if the king tries to walk to like d2, we can just capture and play pawn to f5 with fantastic counter-attacking chances. Likewise with the move queen to d3 here, knight f6 should more or less transpose back into the game. So people don't usually take with the pawn, they prefer to take with the knight, which is by far the better move. Here after the move queen takes e4, the next series of moves is somewhat forced. So after bishop to e3, we should play the move knight to d4, sacrificing a rook. So you'll see in this line, black sacrifices the rook on a8 for a lot of counterplay. It gets very complicated. So for example, one move here is pawn to c4. This is met by knight to c2. In fact, most moves are met by knight to c2. And after the king goes to d2, we should play accurately in this line. Especially in this particular variation, all your moves need to be like spot on basically. So here knight f6, we're sacrificing the rook, but he can't actually take it because after king goes to d8, we're threatening rook d8 check. So queen f3, let's say instead, but here in this variation it's not very good because we can just play bishop f5, and again he can't really take the rook because we have a lot of counterplay. For example, after knight takes rook, queen c2 check, king e1, and queen takes b2, is already clearly better for black. Like we have a lot of threats here. Like if rook d1, bishop g4 could be an issue. Knight e4 is coming, rook d8 is coming, queen c3. So we have a lot of different ideas. So c4 is not usually played. The most played move is knight to c7 check. After knight to c7 check, we play the move king e7, knight takes rook, knight takes c2 check, and here there's two options for white. One loses immediately, so you don't want to go for that one. That is king to e2, but I'll just show you the checkmate after bishop g4. And now white has the option of losing the queen or getting checkmated. So if f3, then we have queen takes e3, a nice checkmate on e3. So instead, most people will play king to d2. Here, a series of forced moves. After knight takes bishop, we play the move knight to f6. Here white has a few options. So there was a few games actually from this position which varied. So one game went king to e1, and here black played the move queen h4 check, g3, queen back to e4. So we're a whole rook down in this position, but black is absolutely fine because we're going to win all the material back, but you do need to play accurately. Now queen c1 was played in that game. Queen takes h1, and if queen c7 here, we can just play knight d7 followed by queen c6, and the end game is perfectly fine for us. So instead, in that game, queen c5 was played, king e6, and if knight c7 check, then we have the move king to f5. Now it gets quite interesting. After queen c2 check, the king goes to g5, and after even you play h4 check, the king will just walk to h5, and there's nothing here for white at all, but you do have to play very accurately. So queen c5 here after knight g4. In fact, black is the one who is completely winning here, since white's unable to castle. He's already moved his king, don't forget that. And even though our king's on h5, we are perfectly safe here. So as you can see, we get into some really interesting positions, especially with our king sort of walking around and white's king walking around. So the material imbalance especially makes things very interesting because you have to play accurately to take advantage of all this. So another move here is queen c2. So after this, we play the move rook to d8. And for example, bishop to d3. This is what happened in this particular game. Queen takes g2 check. The king went to c3, queen c6 check. King back. And here after the move pawn to e4, black could have just had a very big advantage. For example, after the queen trade, we can just take the bishop, and even if we don't trap the knight on b6, we have a bunch of pawns, more than enough for the exchange. We already have 2, and we're probably going to get 3 because we'll win the pawn on e3 at some point as well. So black has tremendous compensation here in this particular variation. So after the move knight to f6, I think the best move for white is queen to b3. After this, I suggest to move rook to d8 check. And again, we have a couple of king moves. One is king e2. We can play the move bishop to e6, queen a3. Here, black is doing very well, even though it may not look like it, but you do have to play good moves again. You can't move the king because knight c7 check. So we have to actually put ourselves into a pin with this move rook to d6, threatening queen c2 check. So rook c1, and here the move queen to d5 is apparently incredibly strong for black, and now we are winning some, if not all, our material back since we're threatening this move. Queen d2 check, as well as bishop g4, as well as knight to e4. So we have a couple of moves which are very difficult for white to stop. So most people play king to e1, and after king to e1, you can continue with the move knight to g4 here, knight to b6, and yeah, the variation I found after knight to c2 was requires some very difficult to find moves. And I think if you haven't seen the position beforehand, it might be quite difficult to believe that black is still completely winning here. For example, after bishop to e2, we can play the move rook to c2. And I believe this might be the only move in the position that is doing well for black. But yeah, we're rook down and we're still attacking hard after the move queen to d4. For example, after queen takes b7, the line continues king to d8 and queen to f3, and now after the move pawn to e4, white's in a lot of trouble because our threat of queen to d2 is coming. The rook can't go to d1 to pin our king. It's quite amazing that black has all these resources. And after queen d2 check as a sample variation, the king moves across, we take it, king g3, and now another accurate move, so we can play the move queen to d3, threatening discovered checks with the knight, and this one is fatal. There's no good way for white to stop this threat, and black's attack continues despite both kings sort of being completely open. So yeah, there's a lot of room, especially like back around here, to analyze different moves for white and options. But as you can see, like black is doing quite well in most of them, and despite being a rook down. So you definitely take a look in your own time if you play this variation and you want to learn more about it. But otherwise, that concludes this video. I hope you enjoyed the video and learned something about this opening. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys on the next opening video. Take care.